Democratic Congressman David Cicilline serves on the House Committee for Foreign Affairs and the Subcommittee on the Middle East and North Africa. Good of you to be here, sir. Thank you. And I want to start by asking you if you concur with the State Department, Jen Psaki, the spokeswoman, who called the attacks on those UN schools, the shelling of UN schools that are being served as shelters by the Israeli military, disgraceful. She also said that there is no excuse. Even if there are rockets being fired nearby, that is no excuse in her words. It does not justify strikes that put at risk the lives of so many innocent civilians. Do you agree with that statement from our State Department?
Well, I think there is no question that the casualties of civilians in this military conflict are horrific, and Israel has a responsibility to do all that it can to mitigate the loss of innocent civilian life. But the reality is we have to understand the context in which this violence is occurring. Israel is a sovereign country that has the responsibility and the absolute right to defend itself from thousands of rockets being shot into Israeli populations in Israel. And they have a responsibility to end that kind of threat to their people and to their country. They ought to do it, of course, in a way which minimizes civilian losses. I think this instance is particularly egregious based on what we're hearing, and a full review must be conducted. But we shouldn't forget what the context of this conflict is. This is a terrorist organization that is shooting thousands of rockets into Israel, and I don't think anyone would think that a country doesn't have a right under those circumstances to defend itself. But it's one of the reasons I think the United States has worked hard to bring a ceasefire, to try to encourage the parties to create breathing space, to stop the fighting and begin to think about a resolution. Israel has now unilaterally said that they would cease military operations. Hamas has rejected that, and I expect will continue shooting rockets. So I think, obviously, anytime there's a civilian loss, but we have to also understand Hamas is leaving civilians and encouraging them to stay in places where there are military assets, purposely to, I think, create the impression that the Israelis are attacking civilians when, in fact, they're attacking military assets. So I think this is a complicated situation. Anytime you see the loss of life, especially the loss of young lives, it's horrific, and the parties need to cease military operations so that we can have an opportunity to really see some path forward that involves a peaceful resolution.
Well, now, the United Nations has not confirmed what you just said. They have not displayed any evidence that the government there in Gaza is encouraging people to stay in their homes when they're being shelled. And in fact, Ban Ki-moon, the Secretary General, has called the attacks on those UN shelters, which is where people are being told to go, totally unacceptable and totally indefensible. And again, the United States, our government, has said that the suspicion that militants are operating nearby does not justify strikes that put at risk the lives of so many innocent civilians. They're not qualifying what's being said.
No,
but you,
I think that's,
go on.
Yeah. No, I think that's absolutely right. But what I'm talking about, and there's, we saw evidence actually when we were briefed about the efforts by the Israeli government to announce when they had identified a military target, to encourage people to leave the area, to do leafleting, loudspeaker announcements, and that they were being discouraged by members of Hamas from leaving these areas. So I think there is ample evidence that the Israeli government has repeatedly attempted to minimize the loss of civilian life. This example is particularly egregious. It ought to be investigated. If in fact turns out that they struck a place where there were individuals who were civilians and became victims of this, it's important to get to the bottom of it. But I do think it's important to remember this is in the context of a country defending itself against oncoming rockets, thousands of rockets, and they have to do everything they can to mitigate that and certainly avoid civilian casualties on both sides. At the same time, we have to recognize they're the only democracy in that region of the world. We have a strategic alliance with them.
Sir, okay.
It's important. I'm sorry.
Let me ask you a question. I want to ask you another question, because you did mention the United States as part of the responsibility, and we are the country that is supplying billions of dollars in aid, as well as much of the firepower that's being used in Gaza. Over the weekend, there were reports that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said in a private conversation to the United States, member of our delegation there, member of our team, that the United States had better not second-guess him again. And there were also reports in Der Spiegel over the weekend that Secretary John Kerry, our Secretary of State, was being eavesdropped upon by the Israeli government, our friendly government there. How do you react to that?
Well, look, I think there is no question that the relationship between the United States and Israel is long-standing and is mutually beneficial to both our countries for the reasons I just explained. It's the only democracy in that region of the world. But the relationship is based on a shared set of values, valuing of human rights, valuing of liberty, of freedom. So it's because of those shared values that I think Israel has a responsibility to be sure they're mitigating civilian losses.
But are you answering my specific question? How do you respond to that statement that we had better not second guess?
No, look,
is that a way an ally should speak with another ally?
Of course not. Look, Israel, I think the relationship between our two countries is more than the relationship between Benjamin Netanyahu and the American people. This is a long-standing, deep, and important relationship. I don't think that's an appropriate thing for him to have said. But obviously the state of Israel will make its own judgments about how to properly defend its own sovereignty. Our relationship with Israel is one that's mutually beneficial to our country and the national security interests of the United States, as well as to the state of Israel. So we'll continue to make judgments based on what are in the best interest of the American people, and I think certainly that the statement by Benjamin Netanyahu was regrettable and doesn't reflect the importance of shared values of our two countries.
Okay, let me ask you one final question, sir. The Pew Research Center has recently put out some numbers that talk about how the different constituents in the United States are responding to what's happening in Gaza, and it shows that younger Americans particularly between 18 and 29 years of age, are not really so in line with what Israel is doing, nor are a lot of people of color, minorities, much of the Democratic constituency, quite frankly. Given the fact that Democrats and Republicans, there's no daylight between the two parties on this issue, it's 100% support for Israel no matter what is going on, who represents those Americans who disagree with what's happening in Gaza right now? Who are their representatives right now in Congress?
Well, I don't know that there's 100% of Israel no matter what's going on. I think there's a recognition that our two countries share values and that we respect the right and the responsibility of the government to protect their people from an ongoing terrorist act. This is not a conflict between Israel and the Palestinians. This is a conflict between Israel and Hamas, a terrorist organization that we've identified as a terrorist organization. So I don't think it's a question of, Israel can do anything it wants, but it's a recognition that we believe Israel has a right to defend herself against an oncoming terrorist attack, thousands of rockets, but obviously to do so in a way which reduces the likelihood of civilian casualties, but also honors its responsibility to protect its citizens.
And so that there is not a Democratic constituency, and there's not a part of the Democratic Congress that would represent those people who dissent from the policy.
Well, I think if you're asking is anyone that represents the interest of Hamas, a terrorist organization, I don't think there is anyone. I think what people want is
Hamas. No, I don't think I've ever mentioned anyone who would represent Hamas.
No, well,
I don't
that's
think
the
any
conflict.
American
The conflict
would.
here is between. So there's a conflict is between Israel and Hamas that we have recognized as a terrorist organization because it is. And so does Israel have the right to defend itself against a terrorist organization? Absolutely. I think that's not only because we respect the sovereignty of Israel, but because we share values, deeply important values to our country of human rights, of the free press, of equality. That's the history of our two countries. So I think when we see that kind of attack of thousands of rockets being sent into Israel, most Americans will say, of course, Israel has a right to defend itself. This is, again, against a terrorist organization. It argues, again, that there has got to be a resolution and a long-term peaceful solution. But in the short term, Israel has a right to defend itself, but has to do it in a responsible way that limits civilian losses and loss of life.
We're out of time. We'll have to leave it there. Thank you very much, Congressman David Cicilline.